Hi, this is Paul. Sometimes after I finish my work in the day, it's like, oh, there's 10 things I want to make a video about. Sometimes it's like, oh, I thought of 10 things today I wanted to make a video about. And then there are other days that I know exactly what I have to talk about. And what we have to talk about is Paul Kingsnorth against Christian civilization video at the 2024 First Things Erasmus lecture. This video came out the day before. I saw it. I knew I wanted to watch it for a whole bunch of reasons because, of course, we all know what Paul Kingsnorth talks about. But then I didn't get a chance to listen to it till early this morning, and it was like, wow. So when I got out of bed, I had to write something, and about the best place to write it was Twitter. And I wrote this: just finished listening to Paul Kingsnorth's First Things talk. Do I have thoughts? A lifetime's worth. To me, it's like someone who has never fully achieved sobriety have an old lover nuzzle up close to a crack pipe with a crack pipe, but in a good way. This talk, at this point in time, triggers all the right conversations. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a lot of easy answers, but it triggers all the right conversations because and less than a week before the American elections. So I'll continue to read the rest of my tweets. After I listened to Paul Kingsnorth after I made the video about Elizabeth Oldfield and Rod Dreher. Because that video I made yesterday, I started making it, and then I get interrupted, and then my head was over here, and then my head was over there. And then I went back to, after the Jordan Peterson thing and a couple other little rabbit trails, I went back to the end of the video where Elizabeth Oldfield talks about this was a tough video to prepare for. Well, why? Well, because so often we see the world in these binary sides and they are anything but. And there's a huge overlap between Elizabeth Oldfield and Rod Dreher, but there is a huge disconnect. And the Rod Dreher on Twitter, the Rod Dreher on his blog, is a culture warrior par excellence. And for years, I started reading Rod Dreher in the early 20-teens. I don't know how I first found him. I first found him from a progressive friend of mine on CRC Voices who posted something that Dreher had written, something from his story about his sister, and it was just so dripping with gospel. I thought, I want to read more of this guy. And then I'm reading his blog, and because my political background, my upbringing, all of that just in some ways makes me sort of instinctively not want to like his blog, but I did like it. And I mean, long before I found Jordan Peterson, Rod Dreher put me on a path. And Rod Dreher sort of provoked me to think a lot harder about a lot of my assumptions. And in a good way, but in a dangerous way. And, I still sometimes I'll read Rod's blog and think, oh, he's so alarmist. But part of the problem is sometimes the alarms he's sounding, I dismiss, and 4 or 5 years later, I think he was right. And then when you meet Rod in person, he came to Sacramento to do an event. I really wanted to spend a lot more time with him, but he's busy at an event like this, and I had to run after the event, and so I never got a chance to speak more with him. He just had a little quick check-in. I had bumped into a couple that I had married, and I'd done their wedding for them. I can't tell the whole backstory to this because he's not on YouTube. But anyway, he couldn't go to my church. They were going to my church, but then he had a friend who was a church planter. And so he went to his church planting's friend's church, and now he's going to a Latin Mass Catholic church. And him and his wife. And she was Reformed, and he was evangelical, and now they're going to a Latin Mass Catholic church here in Sacramento that is full of young families with little children. And I found that out about a year or so ago when he contacted me and said, hey, let's do lunch. I said, great. So we went out to lunch, and I was really waiting to hear, where are you going to church now? And I thought, Orthodox. And because he was right there, you know, the Shane Claiborne stuff, the progressive evangelical, sort of getting into wokish evangelical territory. He sort of got into that in college, and he was doing some biodynamic farming, and so he was sort of in the Waldorf space. So he's in this space that's very Paul Kingsnorth-like, and then he goes Latin Mass Catholic in Sacramento. And it's like, huh. And of course, Rod Dreher goes Orthodox. So this is why this whole right, left, liberal, conservative thing, I think the whole thing is just a bunch of bullshit. Because is Rod Dreher a conservative or a reactionary or a progressive? How about Elizabeth Oldfield? I mean, increasingly these easy words are breaking down. I keep doing these things like someone we know. And so then when Dreher and Oldfield talk, it's like, oh, they're both post-liberal. Their politics is going to be sort of all over the map. Rod Dreher keeps writing all of this stuff, but he's, you know, on a first-name basis with people like Andrew Sullivan, who himself is difficult to sort of place on a map. And then Kingsnorth comes out with this, and it's so pure. The crack hit, it was so pure. But I have such a complex relationship with that crack. Preston Sprinkle and Preston had a thing on YouTube or a thing on Twitter where he sort of had something that he had written with another high-profile, hard-to-place evangelical about the relationship between religion and politics. I said, I'm not quite there. And Preston said, well, we haven't talked for a while. Come on and we'll talk. I said, great, I'd love to. So we've got a date, but it's a ways after the election. But who am I to imagine the election is going to stop any of the drama? I'm just looking for a drama without violence. That's what I'm looking for. But yeah, Paul, boy, he just brought it in that. And at First Things, I mean, it just shows the swirl that is happening. You know, a year or two ago when Peugeot kept telling us, you know, it's going to get weirder, it's going to get crazier, I thought, yeah. And now it's like, oh, yeah, it is crazier. And I don't think we've found the bottom yet, because thinking about where that bottom is can be significantly anxiety producing unless you're really trusting in Jesus. So yesterday's video, I didn't quite know where to land it, didn't quite know, but after I heard Kingsnorth, it was like, I want to do these Venn diagrams where you've got Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, and Paul Kingsnorth, because Dreher mentions Kingsnorth in the video, and so I've been saying for a while, I can't understand the Roman Catholics. And the little loose doll just makes it all the more crazy. And then Father Eric, you know, I love Father Eric. I've always loved Father Eric. Father Eric says, neither do I. It's like, well, good, that's two of us. But it's your denomination. It's your church. But is it a denomination? And then you've got the Orthodox. And it's like every time, okay, I'm trying to understand the Orthodox. And the Orthodox are all the way from Make Constantinople Great Again to Paul Kingsnorth channeling Ivan Illich. And for me and my background, of course, I knew Nate Heil was just all over that thing, his Christian anarchism. And, for me, I often wondered what pieces of me sort of must emerge so that different parts of the TLC get the signal, because how can the TLC sort of stretch from all the way from Grail country to Jacob Federecci? How can the TLC stretch that far? And yet it does, whether you're in it or not. Gosh. They deeply connect. Paul Kingsnorth is in the intersection between Rod and Elizabeth, but the parts where they don't intersect are fascinating. Dreer is down for the culture war. He is fighting that culture war. He's in there with both fists on his blog, living in Budapest, doing it, writing these books. And then, of course, he writes this book on angels, demons, and UFOs. And it's like, and then, of course, today I see that Tucker Carlson has talked about being attacked by a demon, and it's our Orthodox friend from overseas who's doing the interviewing, and I'm thinking, oh, Peugeot, I wish you were more wrong. Oh gosh, Grimkus is going to clip the heck out of that. But that's how I'm feeling. It's wild, it's crazy, it's exciting, it's terrifying, but baby, we're here. Way back when the rest is history didn't have any good microphones, Tom Holland did a thing on culture wars. And the point is, all of this is within Christianity. This is what makes it so interesting, where Elizabeth Oldfield and Roger, Elizabeth and Rod, you'll both listen to this. How about the three of us get together? I'll facilitate your conversation. I want to hear it, because it's like, it's going to be a great conversation, because again, I sometimes sort of liken Rod Dreer to the Apostle Paul. Boy, in his blog and on Twitter, he's throwing punches, but you get him in person, and it's like the Church of Ephesus saying, you're throwing haymakers on Twitter, Rod, but when you get in person, you're as sweet as pecan pie. Wow. And so then I continued. And so many of us are friends. This is where the conversation gets complicated, Preston Sprinkle. Kingsnorth plays the prophet to a room at First Things, of all places. First Things, the naked public square. I remember reading that book in seminary, and it was like, that was probably my first, that was probably the first hit of reactionary that I took. What a book. I read that with my CRC mentor, Dave Beelan. And probably Mark Van Heitzman, the pastor of Olympia CRC, you know him. And Frank Guter, another friend from seminary. Frank, love Frank. And who says we can't have nice things? And then I'm a boomer, I need a GIF. Yes, Elf, Santa's coming. Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe overtones. Santa is real, Peugeotian overtones. It's all here. It's all happening. And gosh, can't stand it. I can't stand it. And then Tucker Carlson is mauled by a demon, in case you thought this was just a passing phase. And the Orthodox got the story. The Orthodox, the crazy Orthodox, coming into the American church scene with their beards and their robes and their $1 million of stone on the floor, and it's just like, why I have a YouTube channel? I can't talk to anybody in my church about this. Maybe chemo. Maybe, is Dog Bark going to get it? I don't know. Even Rick. Rick is going to be like, I'm worried about my pastor. But understanding all of this and piecing it together, I mean, what's it like to live in the eschaton? I don't know. Look around. Here we are. This wasn't the eschaton I'm looking for. I think about Herschel and The Walking Dead saying, yeah, this wasn't the resurrection I was expecting. Yeah, well, no, we sort of knew the eschaton was going to be wild. I don't know if the dispensationalists we're going to have a new round of dispensationalists tweaking the stuff to make it all fit. But we're burying the lead. Let's go. Oh, let's stop. Got to get the settings right. How about now? I think the sound on this is low.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it's very low.
It's lovely to get a round of applause before you said anything.
Let's boost it.
See if we get one at the end.
Yeah. Paul, that's right.
Thank you, Rusty, and thank you to First Things for inviting me to give the Erasmus lecture. It's quite an honor. Actually, I
don't know how many videos First Things puts out, so sound is still kind of low. Let me see if I can boost. I'll boost the signal. I boost the signal, Captain.
was invited to talk, I thought I'd go and have a look at the list of previous speakers just to see what the shape of the land was, and I discovered to my horror that it included foremost intellectuals of their day, great theologians, and one pope. So
it included,
I nearly said no.
I'll help you here, Paul. It included a lot of people who believe in Christian civilization. I get just this picture. I mean, First Things has had a wild, they've had their own wild swings in their history. And gosh.
Oh, but see how it goes. I'd also like to thank First Things for the sterling achievement of getting me into a suit and tie, which is very, very uncommon. So uncommon, in fact, that I had to go to a thrift store today and buy the tie.
And I got to adjust his sound again. And I loved another lecture where he talked about it was in the States, having to go to a thrift store to get an American shirt, which was a plaid shirt. I love it. I absolutely love it. Now, I haven't ever done anything every time I do something with a site I've never done it with before, I always sort of brace myself because you never quite know what that site's going to do. I don't really want to copy strike. And First Things, this is a loving participation, and it will boost your signal. So be gentle with me. I got my invitation to ARC, and I have to make a decision. Last time, I piggybacked it on the Breakwater Festival, so it was like that was a no-brainer. And this time, if I go, I'm going to have to raise money to go, and it's in February in London. I'm living in California, baby. I've lived in cold climes before, but I'm going to have to break out an old jacket for that one. And if I go to Europe in February, I'm going to want to at least get another week or two of events. So, hey, maybe Marcus, you can get me and Paul together back up at your beautiful Priory. Do you have heat up there? So I don't know. This is just too much.
So I hope you like it because it's especially for you. So the last time I was in the United States was only about a year ago, last fall, and I visited, while I was here, the battlefield of Little Bighorn. And it was a beautiful snowy day, and the landscape was vast and white and still. And when we pulled into the...
I've never been there. Of all places to go, I'm really curious how that one came about. Statue of Liberty, Yosemite National Park, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, New York City, Little Bighorn. The rest is history. Episodes on that were great, by the way.
The battlefield site, there was hardly anyone there. A couple of park rangers, a few other visitors. And it made the place feel even more eerie than it would probably feel at any other time. And standing there in the snow, looking up the ridge at the monuments and all the graves, I tried to imagine the psychic reality of living through the end of your culture. I tried to imagine being an Indian or a Native American who faced not only the trauma of mass land theft and a future of being forced onto reservations, but also the harder to bear psychic wound of losing your entire metaphysics.
And I thought he laid that out nicely. Now, again, I very much recommend The Rest is History, because that cleaned up a lot of history for me, because, actually we have all of this mythology. Of course, Richard Dawkins is allergic to that, but we Petersonians tend to drink heavily of it. And to learn that most of these Plains Indians had actually been generationally displaced from other places early east, and so they were new to the plains about as much as the pioneers, who were only a couple of decades after them, and the whole thing is just a tremendously sad story. But Kingsnorth is right. Their world is coming to an end. I've been thinking a lot lately about worlds and what they are. I read Iliada's book, Sacred and the Profane, and their worlds were coming to an end, and it's a terrifying thing. And I think, with the level of anxiety in our culture right now with respect to almost everything, I think people have a maybe just a tiny sense of the terror of that, even without the kind of realization, or the level of realization that, of course, that tragic period. Again, listen to The Rest is History. The whole series on it was really excellent.
Seeing everything you thought you knew about the world, about your people, about your land, the shape of the universe, its gods and spirits, just disintegrating beneath you. And I realized as I stood there that America did not just take the land from the Indians, it took their entire world, inner and outer. Now, of course, America is hardly the first or the only society to have done this. A grand sweep of human history seems to demonstrate that this is how humans basically operate all of the time. They expand, they seek new lands, and if they find people already on them, conflict ensues.
Calling Brett Weinstein.
A technologically more advanced society will inevitably displace and possibly destroy a less well-equipped culture.
Not always a technologically society. I went at sometimes, Afghanistan. Sometimes the locals win. It takes a fair amount to displace, but of course, smallpox did a lot of the job before the guns ever got there.
Technologically advanced, of course, does not imply spiritually or culturally advanced, however much it's common to hear these things elided. But it is hard to find a country which doesn't have at least one example of a people having its world wiped out. My own country, Britain, has several. My first novel was a 300-page exploration of the psyche of an Anglo-Saxon pagan, losing his world to Norman and Christian conquest. But the fact that this is a common pattern doesn't make it any less traumatic for those who lose everything. What are they to do? Fight back and hope to win? Fight back knowing they will lose but go down with their world? Become part of the new culture, turn their back on the old? Or become part of the new world and seek to retain what can be retained? Maybe the answer depends on personality and on circumstance. Native culture in this country, of course, offers plenty of examples of all these options being taken, and the names of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are globally famous now as examples of two men who refused to surrender their worlds. But less famous is the name of Charles.
And again, listen to The Rest is History. I'm sure there's plenty of other great books on this. But it's helpful that he brings, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And again, I didn't know that much of them. Part of the problem with a variety of mythologies is that you have a taste of it and you don't do much digging. And they're interesting stories, but of course, the story he's about to tell is an even more interesting story.
Charles Alexander Eastman, their worlds. But less famous is the name of Charles Alexander Eastman, or to use the name he was given by his people, the Santee Dakota, Ohiyesa. Ohiyesa was just 18 at the time of Custer's last stand, but his life was in some ways an illustration of the conflicting pulls of the time. a Native American with a white grandfather, himself a former US soldier. He grew up learning the traditional ways of the Dakota Sioux. When he was a teenager, however, his father, who'd been sent to an internment camp for his part in an uprising against the whites, returned wearing a suit and tie and professing a new faith. His father instructed Ohiyesa to Europeanize his ways as much as possible in order to succeed in the new world that was rising around them.
Now, it helps that I know where the speech is going, because I've listened to it already. But part of where I'd be in conversation with this talk is exactly at this point. Because we're going to point out the evils of civilization, and Paul Kingsnorth he doesn't deny this, the inescapability of it, and so often the evils just follow from its blessings. They are deeply intertwined with one another in a way that in the age of decay, we can't really seem to pull them apart.
The Indian's job now, Ohiesa's father told him, was not to submit to reservation life, but to succeed on his own terms in white society. Sending his son off to an American school, he told him, "It is the same as if I sent you on your first warpath. I shall expect you to conquer." And Ohiyesa.
So, is the son Abraham? I mean, this is the version. I mean, I've listened to Jordan Peterson give this version so often. It's a good question, and once you start playing with Jordan Peterson's interpretation of Abraham, you can have some fun with it because it goes some different ways.
Ohiyesa did. Changing his name to Charles Alexander Eastman, he became a prolific writer and a speaker on Indian life and culture, one of the first Native Americans to qualify as a doctor, a historian of his people, and a vigorous campaigner for Indian rights. His life's work was to try and build bridges between the new white culture and that of his shrinking people. He believed...
Now, it's also helpful to remember that I did a video right after ARC. And again, didn't see Paul Kingsnorth at ARC. You kind of see why. And you can see why a little bit later in the talk, too. And in that video about ARC, you go all the way back, and there's a lion on the thumbnail. Because I read this piece about lions and foxes. And of course, end of the Indian Wars, after the Civil War, beginning of the Progressive Era, Protestants were lions. They were lions in civilization. And the takeover of this young man, the takeover of his father that led to the takeover of his young man to go into white society and conquer. This is a lion move, and this is a confident civilization. Now, you can find similar things in freed slaves who come north, and George Washington Carver, where African Americans are going to come into American society, and they are going to conquer it, and they are going to achieve, and they are going to take part. And this obviously is in a context where there's way more roadblocks by race and racism and all of those things, but they are going to come into the society, and they are going to conquer. And of course, Jews did the same thing, and so wonderful conversation a while ago between Glenn Lowry and a woman Jewish academic who basically said, yeah, when we were young, we said, hey, you're a Jew, you're gonna have to outwork, outcompete, outsmart everyone else because you've got a higher hurdle to overcome. Native Americans understood this. African Americans understood this, but it was a lion society, and off they were going to go.
That the new America needed an indigenous soul, and that his people could help provide it. Perhaps this is why his name is not as famous as those of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. His path was not one of brave but doomed military resistance. It was messier and harder to pin down.
And Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, especially if you look at what happens to Sitting Bull, that fits into a romance mythology. That fits into a romance mythology that is popular post 1960s. In the Lion Society, before the counterculture, this man would have been more highly regarded. Yet even at the time, Sitting Bull would have been an object of curious, novel fascination. Whereas this man was just doing the right thing and would be applauded by many people, even though hated by those that he outcompete.
Ohiyesa also became a Christian. In his autobiography, The Soul of an Indian, he writes movingly about the horrors which many so-called Christians imposed on his people, but how nonetheless the path and teachings of Jesus spoke to him as true. In his autobiography,
of course, the Christian Reformed Church has been having this massive fight for a while. And don't do this. I got to look up that book. Come on, Amazon. Don't. You know, I'm still recording. And I often tell people, read things like 12 Years a Slave, but read the book itself, because part of the reason you read primary source material if you're doing history is because the historiography continues to change. The perspectives that we embody today when we look back in the past, they shape what our experience of the past is. And so I'm definitely going to, come on, get it. Yeah, 99 cents for the Kindle. There we go. Bang. In the Kindle library. Now I just have to read it. I'll probably download a PDF too. Actually, a PDF would be better because anyway. There's a lot going on here. Again, in the CRC we've been having these fights going on, and it's been so interesting. So the CRC has a classis Red Mesa of Navajo, some Zuni, Rehoboth, which was a school and now is a Christian school. I mean, very complex history, but part of my when the woke stuff started coming up, part of why I reacted so strongly to it was, at least with respect to African Americans, I knew people. I was raised by that community. And I always knew that the shallow, low-resolution stereotypes that were trying to replace other shallow, low-resolution stereotypes were just all shallow, low-resolution stereotypes, that when it comes to human beings and their religion and their stories and their perspectives, there's no end to complexity and nuance, especially for important, gifted leaders, as this man clearly was.
He tells the story of how he traveled around to meet many of his own people as a Christian missionary, telling the stories of Jesus, explaining the values of the faith. At one such meeting, an old man, after a long silence, stood up and replied to him. "I have come to the conclusion," said the old man, "that this Jesus was an Indian. He was opposed to material acquisition and to great possessions. He was inclined to peace. He was as unpractical as any Indian, and set no price on his labor of love. These are not the principles upon which the white man has founded his civilization." Ohiyesa sympathized. "I confess," he wrote in his memoir, "I have wondered much that Christianity is not practiced by the very people who vouch for that wonderful conception of exemplary living."
And of course, you can read Gandhi's autobiography about very impressed by Jesus, less so by the Christians that had come to India and South Africa. And of course, because I mentioned Gandhi, I'll get a whole group of comments, which Algo loves. Some of them will disappear. Now, I don't delete comments, so if your comment disappears, it was YouTube. Please understand that.
It appears that they are anxious to pass on their religion to all other races, but keep little of it for themselves.
That's a great line. And that's not just true of passing it on between races. It's often true just of passing it on. Missionaries are sinners too.
"I have not yet seen the meek inherit the earth, or the peacemakers receive high honor." Observations like this led Ohiyesa towards the end of his...
The Beatitudes. Now, if you follow the channel closely, you know that for a number of times I did some preaching on it. The Beatitudes are complex, and this whole question is complex, and we're going to have to get into some of this complexity, because way over here we have against Christian civilization, and over here we've got ARC. And even though I think they were both at ARC last time, Rod Dreher was there. I didn't bump into him, but I know he was there. There were a lot of people there. I think Elizabeth Oldfield was there. And, you know, it's coming up again. And of course, it's kind of Jordan Peterson's thing. Well, what's going on?
His life to a radical conclusion. He didn't reject Christianity or Christ. Neither did he ever cease to think of himself as an American. But he came to see something about his faith which perhaps only someone of his background could have seen. At the end of his life story, he tells us what it is. It is my personal belief, he writes, after 35 years' experience of it, that there is no such thing as Christian civilization. I believe that Christianity and modern civilization are opposed and irreconcilable, and the spirit of Christianity and of our ancient religion is essentially the same. Now, today it's the
Now, I talk about smuggling a lot and Jesus smuggling because that's sort of Brett Weinstein, Jesus smuggling. But the point that I made, you can go back and you can find a video where I've got a Silk Road and a whole bunch of riders, and I put heads of sort of, John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson and myself. Because Jesus has been smuggling himself into all sorts of other ideas for a very long time. And of course, there's also general revelation. So the way that Jesus colonizes other religions is super sneaky. Part of it, of course, is because in Christianity, the Redeemer is the creator. And that adds a layer here. But it's super complicated. I have at Living Stones, I have a men's group, and we actually do it on Zoom. Don't ask me for an invitation because I limit it. There are a few online people. My friend Warren is in, and Bowtie Brian, who shows up on the Freddie and Paul show, he's in. But almost everybody else is local. But the local numbers are so few, I let in a few online. But we've been reading through the book of Deuteronomy. We've been reading through the Pentateuch together, and it is so interesting. Deuteronomy 25, where you have the unsandaled. That's a great story. Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt? When you were weary and worn out, when they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind, they had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. 1 Samuel 15. Samuel said to Saul, I am the Lord. I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Now, of course, everybody's like, well, that's horrible. Why do you have to kill all the animals? Well, the point is that if, in fact, Saul is doing this for the Lord, he is not to profit from it personally. It's the same point with the ban. It's the same point with Jericho. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them to Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. And Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the east border, blah, 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 blah. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle and the fat calves and the lambs and everything that was good. You know, doing the Lord's work is fine, but it's really good if we can, make a little money at it. That whole ban thing, that's a little extreme. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and turned and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel reached him. Saul said, The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, What then is the bleating of sheep in my ears? What is the lowing of cattle I hear? Saul answered, The Israelites brought them up from the Amalekites, but they spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord has said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied, and then he's not going to like what he has to hear. And then Samuel, sort of retired, but not quite disabled. Then Samuel said, Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, Surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, As your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. And then Samuel, get up. I got something for you to do. There's a family I want you to see. There's a boy I want you to anoint. And of course, in comes David. Now, there's a world of complexity to this. And again, it's funny because on the basis of this one video, if you only see this one video, you'll have all kinds of ideas about how I read the Bible and who I am and how you project this onto me. But I've got 300 plus rough drafts of sermons online, if you really care to know. No one in their right mind should care to know that much, perhaps. At least not all at once. But it's complicated. I get that. But you can't just sort of put this away, because Paul Kingsnorth here is very much fulfilling a prophetic role, and I rejoice in the fact that he's fulfilling it so well. That's been his role. But again, what's so funny is that I so often hear people on one side, we're being prophetic, and then they're saying all kinds of things. And other groups, we're being prophetic. And the thing about prophets, if you read the Old Testament, is that, and the New Testament to a degree, is that there's just so many of them. There's just sort of like what C.S. Lewis has to say in The Abolition of Man about instincts. There's just so many of them. And so then it becomes a challenge to be, well, which ones do you listen to? And I think Paul is being a faithful prophet right here. I think he is voicing this prophetic voice for the church. But is it the only voice? And this is exactly where the problems arise, because by virtue of our culture, we don't do multivocal well. We really don't. We don't quite know how to process it. Now, well, let's get some more.
Europeans and the Americans who are experiencing our own form of cultural and metaphysical collapse. The West is now undergoing its own loss of a sense of self and culture, a history and stability. After centuries of global hegemony, it's our turn to experience the fear of such a loss and of decline and fragmentation. Around the time that Ohiyesa was doing his work, the German historian Oswald Spengler was writing his gloomy masterpiece, The Decline of the West. Spengler had developed a theory about the rise and fall of human civilizations, all of which, he said, could be fitted into his pattern. He declared that Western culture, Faustian culture as he called it, defined as it was by its outward-looking, conquering materialist ethos, had already begun to ossify at the beginning of the 19th century, and that it was rotting from within even as it dominated the world. The early 21st century, he predicted, would see the beginning of its collapse and a return to formlessness. Writing a few decades later, the British historian Arnold Toynbee echoed Spengler's prediction in his own painstakingly developed cyclical model of the rise and fall of cultures. His vast multi-volume work, A Study of History, examined 21 civilizations across the span of human time, seeking common reasons for their rise and fall. 19 of these 21 civilizations, he concluded, collapsed when they reached the moral state the United States is in now.
Now, of course, this part won't be in any way controversial to a lot of people, because a lot of people who are worried about civilizational Christianity, because that's just the thesis. We have lost the way. We are consuming the resources of our ancestors who were our betters.
Note that now was quite some time ago. Toynbee died in 1975. So I've taken to calling this strange, dissolving, increasingly nihilistic moment that we're living through the culture of inversion. The process can best be understood, I think, by simply observing that our elites today are focused overwhelmingly on inverting the culture that we took for granted when I was growing up. This inversion takes many forms and can be found in almost every crevice of society now, from the curriculum in schools to the output of the Disney Corporation. You'll all be able to think of your own examples, I'm sure. They're not hard to find. Turning everything on its head is now what the West does. But what is this West? Well, it depends who you ask. A liberal, a conservative, a reactionary, a Marxist might have very different answers. But let's instead ask a historian. In his book, Religion and the Rise of Western Culture, written shortly after World War II, the medievalist Christopher Dawson offered his own definition. There has never been, he wrote, any unitary organization of Western culture apart from that of the Christian Church, which provided an effective principle of social unity. Behind the ever-changing pattern of Western culture, there was a living faith which gave Europe a certain sense of spiritual community, in spite of all the conflicts and divisions and social schisms that marked its history. The West, said Dawson, was a religious construction. Specifically, it was a creation of the Roman Christian Church. This is the only reason we talk about a West at all. But the claim immediately raises a question. If the Christian faith is the basis of Western culture, what happens when the faith retreats or is rejected? We know the answer because...
So now we're very much in Tom Holland land, because, I mean, if you're a devotee to the rest of his history, I'm way behind lately, but we'll see if I catch up. The West is Latin Christendom. That is what it is. The East, well, of course, Paul joins the Orthodox. But again, the Orthodox, we got Kingsnorth on one end, then we have people that make Constantinople great again faction on the other. And of course, Putin is way out there in the third Rome.
Because that rejection or retreat, what the poet Matthew Arnold called the long, melancholy, withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, has been going on for centuries. And as we survey the 21st century landscape, at least in Western Europe, I think we can see that our founding religion is decisively dead as a guiding force and a cultural glue. The question that logically arises from that observation is the decline of Christianity responsible for our current malaise? Is our lack of faith at the root of our loss of confidence and the ensuing inversion of our old values?
Now this is where we're going to run straight into the Tom Holland thesis. And a great video out there is the video that Marcus put together with Paul Kingsnorth and Tom Holland. And I thought, oh, genius, Marcus. It was a great conversation. Great conversation. Because suddenly you have to ask questions about, and I know some people have been making videos about, you know, the charge, the relationship between secularization and Protestantism has risen to a point that some people are pushing back on it. That's absolutely fine, because there's plenty of nuance to be explored in all of these vast historical theses. But how much Christianity is under this stuff? And what role does sort of the conscious awakening of it have? And what role does the overt confessional professions play? I believe in God. I believe in Jesus. I mean, this stuff is the bread and butter of this channel. This is the stuff that we can't talk about enough. This is stuff that I can't talk about enough, even though a bunch of you get like, would you give it a break already? But I remain puzzled and mystified at the degree that Christianity endures in populations, something of Christianity endures in populations and peoples that have long since, on the surface, say they've given it up. And that's very much where I sit right next to Jordan Peterson, and he says, to that group at Lafayette College, Christianity is what you act out. Doesn't mean what that rider on the elephant goes flapping on about. And Jordan Peterson's going to get a mention pretty quick.
Values. And the answer to this, in one sense, is obviously yes. As another historian, Tom Holland, demonstrated in his book Dominion, it was Christianity which formed the Western mind. When such a sacred order dies, there will be upheaval at every level of society, from the level of politics right down to the level of the soul. And this, I think, is where we are. I'm hardly the only one to have noticed. In fact, almost everyone who is paying attention has by now noticed. Some of those people, in response, have come to a conclusion that since Christianity was the basis of this Western culture of ours, and since this culture is now sick or even dying, the way to revive it must be to revive Christianity. Not so much as a faith, but rather as a social glue, or even as a weapon.
And this is, of course, where the whole ARC project comes in. And the ambiguities beneath it. And the ambiguities beneath someone like Jordan Peterson. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali is going to get a mention. But again, if you ask me at Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Jordan Peterson, part of what I will say is that, like Tom Holland, like Louise Perry, many of these people have taken on the modernist, secularist, coy posture about their personal faith and their public agenda. And, all right, if you want to play it that way, I'm a Christian minister. Paul Kingsnorth, in for a penny, in for a pound. Let's join the Romanian monastery. So, I love this talk. I love this talk. I love this talk. I want you all to hear that. I love this talk. But I'm this weird guy who on one hand will stand right there with Paul Kingsnorth and put my arm around him and say, that was amazing. I wish I could give a talk that good. But I also sit down and I'll cheer on Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau. And even my Orthodox friends that want to make Constantinople great again, because I don't fear them, because it isn't going to happen like they think it's going to happen, because nothing ever does. Now, this is not rough draft for Sunday yet. That will come tomorrow. But as always, the stuff going on through my head, I always need illustrations for a sermon. It's got to get embodied in some place. And so the thing I couldn't get out of my mind after listening to this was standing on the steps of that Orthodox church in Riverside, California, and listening to the preacher with the funny accent just talk about $1 million of marble in the building. And Jonathan, and I really just wanted him to move aside and let Jonathan, he'd give us a tour of the building. And because, when Jonathan shows me orthodoxy, I think, wow, that's pretty cool. When a lot of other people show me orthodoxy, I think, no thanks. And of course, this guy with orthodoxy, oh. And of course, after I had read those two books about Pius XI and Pius XII, I needed to read more about popes. And then I pick up John O'Malley's book on the history of the popes, and I get to chapter 3, and he begins with, Constantine was not a pope, but a Roman Empire from 312 to 337. Yet he was, with the exception of St. Peter himself, more important for the papacy and for Christianity itself than any pope. Some people hailed the decree of Vatican Council II on church-state relations as the end of the Constantinian era, by which they meant the end of 1700 years of certain patterns of church-state relationships that had their origin with the emperor. The assertion may be exaggerated, but it at least indicates that something momentous happened to the church with Constantine. And then off the chapter goes. So we've got a lot going on in terms of conversations in North America about Christian nationalism. Of course, The UK has a state church. The Netherlands has a state church. Germany has a state church. France has a state church. I mean, they all have state churches, sort of, kind of. They're societies, but America, well, we had sort of liony, waspy, mainline Protestantism that we didn't actually have a state church. It wasn't Roman Catholic or Lutheran or Reformed, but it was a consensus about the role that church would play. And we had a president. And so in the middle of the 20th century, if you had an important group of people, you'd make sure you have a minister there. Maybe even Billy Graham, and Billy Graham would be the spiritual advisor to the presidents.
Not so much as a faith, but rather as a social glue, or even as a weapon. What we need, we increasingly hear from many different quarters, is a return to something called Christian civilization, regardless of whether the Christian faith is in fact true. At a certain level, this might...
And so this is where we get to Nathan Jacobs. And is Jordan Peterson a utilitrad? Is it, and what do we mean by true? Do we mean, are we going to, like Richard Dawkins, try to line up a bunch of, in fact, there are way too many events in the Bible that you're going to line up. So, of course, Richard Dawkins makes a selection based on what he thinks the Enlightenment is. And so then those are going to be the litmus test to whether or not this is true. And Jordan Peterson is going to talk about mythology. See the videos that I've made over the last week and even way before that. So we're going to have that whole conversation.
Might appear to be a superficially attractive narrative, but I think it's a deadly mistake. I'm going to attempt here to explain why. So some time ago, a question came to me as I read the Bible. I thought, what if God agrees with Ohiyesa? At the very beginning of the first book of the Bible, we find a claim about what a human is created to be. God scoops up soil from the ground, breathes in it, and humans appear. We're raised from the ground naked and placed in a garden to tend and keep it, in communion with everything that lives, in conversation with all the birds and animals. Humans, it turned out, were created to be vegetarian gardeners.
Now, if we're going to be a little stick to the text, of course, we've got Noahides coming a little bit later, of course, but actually it's kind of an orchard. Did you ever notice that? It's an orchard. And so they're sort of gatherers. They're not hunters. Once they get cast out of the garden, then they're going to till the field, and then the agricultural society, the agrarian society is going to start. So there's a lot here, but I can only sort of nitpick because I have the ability to stop and pause and make my own comments, which to one degree or another, I'm sure that the owners of this video will appreciate that I'm not just sort of wholesale stealing the dumb thing. Not dumb, I'm sorry, it's not dumb at all. I love it, but it's wholesale stealing of a thing.
We were created to be so close to God that we could see him walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. It's a beautiful image. And one day it's implied we might be spiritually mature to eat the fruit of the forbidden trees and share in the knowledge and wisdom of God himself. Well, that's not how things turned out. And when we disobeyed, what happened? Farming happened. Work happened. Hunting happened. Metalwork happened. Murder happened. Cities happened. Civilization happened. It was all a deadly result of our fall.
Now, of course, at the end of the talk, some people are going to say, well, wait a minute, New heavens and new earth? Now, it's a city not built by human hands, and I think he has a really good answer to that question, but it's a fair question.
Since we were expelled from this garden, it seems we've been building great towers to the sky, trying, if subconsciously, to return to our true home. But always the towers are brought down, and our tribes are scattered. In the first book of Kingdoms, the people of Israel tell their judge, Samuel, that they want a king to rule over them. The judges were religious leaders, supposedly ruling on God's behalf, but the people of Israel had had enough of this theocracy. We want a king to be over us, they say. Then we will be like all the other nations, and our king will judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.
Now what's also interesting, because I've just been preaching through all this stuff recently, is that Eli's sons were corrupt. Samuel's sons were corrupt. And so the elders think that a monarchy is an upgrade, which is going to address the problem of the sons of corrupt autocrats. And built then into the text is also sort of a critique of this when Ammon, Absalom, Adonijah didn't go so well. Even Solomon, when, just listen to my last sermon, I posted it here. I didn't do the rough draft because schedule. So this stuff is all really complicated. Now, part of the difficulty here is that underneath this, what we really need to do is have a pretty significant conversation about, I don't know, Augustine comes to mind, city of man and city of God. Because someone might listen to this and say, is there some romanticism in this mixture? Because once we had tamed nature, for the most part, hurricanes still ravage. Once we put it on a leash, for the most part, then suddenly it became a friend. Now, of course, those issues will, of course, be complex for the mixture of Native American culture plus Christianity that Eastman will come into. But, and again, I love this talk. But I've been around a while, and I've lived with these ideas a while, and other things emerge. And I recognize that it can be a little easy when you're not really noticing that nature is red in tooth and claw, and that tiger behind the plexiglass, who can't fully understand that there, would definitely eat your toddler. And so this relationship with nature is a super complex thing.
Samuel warns them that their king will do other things too. He will conscript their sons into war and take their daughters to be his perfumers and bakers. He will take the best crops from their fields and vineyards. He will tax them 1/10 of their grain, their animals and their servants. And if the people cry out in the end against this tyranny, the Lord will not hear you in those days, because you chose a king for yourselves. Well, the people choose one anyway, and the rest of the history of Israel plays out. Again,
choose one anyway. You know, as a preacher, you're always shaping the story, but you seldom do it without any internal conversation. Because if you read the story, the Lord says, go ahead. And he says, go ahead because, Samuel, this isn't really just about you. This is about me. And part of the path of the Bible is that God seems to take a special pleasure in sometimes giving us exactly what we ask. And we discover that it's really a disaster. And God says, watch what I can do even with your sinfulness. I can make something glorious.
And again, the people pursue earthly power and turn away from God. Often they confuse the two. Eventually, God stages an intervention, appearing himself in human form to turn things around. But he doesn't appear in the form of a king, or a judge, or a procurator, or a wealthy aristocrat.
And again, it's a talk. I understand. Rhetoric. It's for impact. And this is where, obviously, the Beatitudes get complex, because this is a talk that I've given a number of times on the channel. One of the last times that I went through the Beatitudes, I discovered I'm going to read all the Beatitudes of the Bible. And so I'm reading all these Beatitudes in the Psalms and the Proverbs. And then I read the Beatitudes in Matthew, and it's like, Jesus is doing something here. All of his listeners understand. Blessed are those who can delay gratification, for they shall become wealthy and wise. Blessed are those who learn their lessons well, for they will be considered smart. Blessed are those who do what God tells them, For God will cause them to flourish, because, of course, and again, I've preached about this often too, you have this basic level of religion, especially very God number one-ish, where do good things happen. Do bad things, and bad things happen. But, of course, you've got that pesky book of Job, where bad things happen to Job, and all of his friends say, yeah, you must have done bad things. We know the rules. And then, of course, Jesus comes and does good things, and bad things happen. And so those Beatitudes of Jesus are definitely pointing beyond to saying that something else is happening here with me, something else I am bringing. Blessed are the meek. There's no more audacious thing to say. And again, if you watch Steve Martin's Leap of Faith, I love that line, blessed are the meek. I say all the meek get are the short end of the stick. It's like, yeah, Steve Martin. Yeah, that's right. And that's why blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. And that's why the Native Americans who listened carefully said, but the African Americans also listened carefully. Oh, it's such a rich, complex story.
He appears as a carpenter in a backwoods province of empire, and he spends his time with the weak and the despised, wandering in the desert and the countryside.
Was it a backwoods province of empire? Because empire had been building its suburbs all around there, and I can pull books off the shelf. And fairly likely Jesus was building their new subdivisions, perhaps.
Through small towns and villages. And when he finally goes to the city, to the civilized center, it tortures and kills him. At the very least, I think we can say that this God of ours has an ambivalent relationship to humanity's earthly power structures. At no point does he ever enthusiastically embrace them. Often he rejects them.
See, and this is where things can get a little Marcion, because no, it's that the story is more complex with that. Now, again, I think one of the key things that happens in the Gospels is Jesus rearranges messiahship, but we still also have the book of Revelation. And so I can't fully exorcise kingdom from kingdom of heaven. And this is where I think Preston Sprinkle, who I suspect is going to come more with an Anabaptist tradition, and this is where this is super funny, because on one hand, Paul Kingsnorth is Orthodox, but there are moments when he sort of sounds like an Anabaptist. And this is, of course, where sort of the Calvinists get funny, because on one hand, we're magisterial, but on another hand, we should pay attention to our failures. And Calvinists continue to wonder, did we do right by Servetus? Because when Calvinists came to America, they also, with Quakers and others, decided on religious liberty, and I think there's a lot of that beneath this. And you cannot really get into the hardness of the book of Deuteronomy or the Torah or many of the Old Testament books. You can't dismiss that, even though Christians feel uncomfortable because, of course, the Jesus Revolution has continued to change that. But you've got the Sermon on the Mount, and it's an enormous, complex story that Christian civilization has been weaving for years. And the fact that within Christianity we have vivid discussions with respect to government and power. And in the wake of our godless conquests, well, again, to bring up Tom Holland, it was the British Empire that ends the slave trade. It's the British Empire that began to reduce polygamy. Dominion chapter 17, religion. His mission, so he believed, was one of emancipation. That was why, returning to London in 1790, he had made common cause with the abolitionists. Slavery, after all, came in many forms. If divine providence had bestowed upon Britain the chance to end the transportation of human chattel across the Atlantic, then also it had granted to the East India Company an incomparable opportunity to abolish the practices that kept Hindus in servitude to superstition. 1813, while the company was embroiled in negotiations with the British government over a renewal of its charter, Grant had seized this chance. For decades, he had been demanding that its directors be legally obliged to work for the religious and moral improvement of the Hindus. Now, in a decisive moment, the campaign had come to the very heart of power. Evangelicals, it's the old kind, evangelicals had enthusiastically rallied to the cause. 908 petitions had been delivered to Parliament. The British government, as it would the following year, then pressed to alter its policy on the slave trade, had bowed to public opinion. The charter had been amended. Even with its success under his belt, Grant had persisted in his activism. One Hindu practice more than any other had loomed in his nightmares. If we had conquered such a kingdom as Mexico, where a number of human victims were regularly offered every year upon the altar of the sun, should we have calmly acquiesced in this horrid mode of butchery? Grant's question addressed the directors of the company, one that even after his death in 1823 continued to reverberate. As Kennedy, in distant Baroda, I don't know, watched, and some of you are going to, thank you for putting in the comment sections how to pronounce these words, performing the ritual required of sati. So Britain was seized by one of its periodic fits of morality. Demands were becoming overwhelming for a ban on the self-immolation of widows, all of which put the company in a bind. Despite the change in its charter, it remained reluctant to interfere in the religious practices of its Hindu subjects, something that also comes with Christianity. What, though, if it could be proven that Suti was not a religious practice? The question, of course, was one that would have made no sense at all before the coming of the British to India, but increasingly, after decades of rule by the company, there were Indians who understood its implications very well. Hindus who used such words as religion or secular or Hinduism were not merely displaying their fluency in English. They were also adopting a new and alien perspective on their country and turning it to their advantage. Evangelicals were not alone in opposing the immolation of widows. There were Hindus who were opposed it as well. For centuries, praise of sati had alternated into forthwith condemnation, and on it goes. And eventually, it will be stopped. Now, I wanted to mention, I don't have enough time to go through the whole video. As much as I would like to, as much as I would
sometimes
so like to, because it is so, so good. I finished Paul's talk, and I immediately had to listen to some Ken Miedema. Who on earth is Ken Miedema? I think it was my junior high. We called it graduation. I know we weren't supposed to. But yeah, I know I raised my voice and the dog comes. It's okay. Yeah, I know you're getting tired of me being here. This is becoming a habit, and you want me to get home. So I got to finish the video. I talk so loud she can't think. Ken Miedema, blind, West Michigan, CRC lad, learned to play the piano. Was a big hit on the CRC circuit. Played for my junior high graduation. I am a tree by the riverside. I'm a strong young tree. A Christian song, beautiful song. You can look it up on YouTube. Ken Miedema, as he grew older, had his more radical side. There were two magazines that I used to read in my younger days, and some of you are going to roll your eyes and unsubscribe. Not the Paul Kingsnorth element of this strange new group we have emerging of Christians with degrees of conflict among us, but yet a sense of community and conversation. Sojourners on the Other Side. They were my favorite Christian magazines in college and right after college. I loved Sojourners on the Other Side. And it was in The Other Side. The Other Side was the first one to sort of embrace the LGBTQ. There wasn't all the alphabets then, but they were the first ones to embrace it, sort of the radical evangelicals. And Ken Miedema, I believe he was living in the Bay Area then, and he went with them, affirming, what is the CRC to do? Ken Miedema had long since sort of progressed out of the CRC and grown older, and he's still out there making music. In fact, for a while I was thinking about, I wanted to play some music on his channel, so I actually contacted a guy who used to teach art at Eastern Christian. His wife is still Ken Miedema's manager. And yeah, just look up Ken Miedema and listen to the song Kingdom in the Streets. Or listen to the song The Call. And this is I love this talk. I love this talk. But I also have all these other thoughts and feelings. And I'm not going to, and here's where I think we go wrong. In action, we always have to choose. But prior to action, I think we need to live with this full-blooded Paul Kingsnorth talk in our heads. He needs a part of our consciences Congress. So does Ivan Illich. So do the Christian anarchists, Jacques Ellul. They need to be in there because this voice must be heard. But the civilization voice, that's in there too. And just like none of us know how the future is going to go, and Paul Kingsnorth will, I should probably jump to the end. He'll mention Peterson and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and again, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she's in church, she's piecing it together. Jordan Peterson, I think he's still a seeker. He's got to keep it all together with all the different parts of his consciousness Congress. We all do. We all do. So he answers the new heavens coming down from heaven answer.
Better one than that.
Yes.
What would you recommend someone who is like entering into the power structures we're in, or kind of someone working for the Trump administration?
I don't have to get involved. So, and the answer is I'm flying home tomorrow, so I don't have to get involved. But I don't know. It's the seriousness of the question is, I suppose it's a common thing people ask is like, what should we do at this time? How should we? We have jobs, we have institutions we work in, and they're all part of this collapsing thing.
You're our prophet. Tell us what to do. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. And Paul's honest with it. He's like, I live in this world too. He's flying home. He's speaking at First Things. He has a Substack. He writes for money. He's not a desert father. And there's lots to talk about with respect to all of this. And I know this is why a couple of my friends on Twitter started, getting ready to go. And I said, don't do this on Twitter. Do not do this on Twitter. You can't do this on Twitter. There's way, way too much to talk about. Civilization, and this is the you cannot banish the prophetic from civilization, and in many ways prophets also need civilization. There's prophets, priests, and kings, and Jesus occupies all three offices. There's my Reformed doctrine. There's the Heidelberg Catechism, prophets, priests, and kings, and they all have a place to play. But here in the age of decay, we will not. The meek will inherit the earth. But it's going to take a new heaven and a new earth, and Paul is right. It is given by God. But there's a connection between that which God gives and that which we do. And I know that there are some people that are enormously frustrated to the point that they have pulled their hair out so much they have less hair than I do. Well, that's not really why they've lost their hair. But we're always trying to work that balance, to figure that out, and we need the prophets, and so just right there, I think Dominion is a great book to sort of think about this, because I think part of the gift of the book of Dominion and part of the genius that I think Tom Holland has brought to this is the recognition that Not made by human hands. Gosh, I wish I could find that. It was a conversation with Peugeot and Roland, and it was great. Not made with human hands. Now, maybe some of you will find it. Does not mean floated down from heaven per se. Now, again, hear me carefully. I don't have anything, problems with things floating down from heaven. Jesus flew up. I'm there. Listen to Glenn Scrivener's latest.
Sets being a Christian apart is the reality of Jesus Christ. It's God becoming human, living a human life, being fully human and fully God, dying completely, rising from the dead, being present with us now.
And you believe that absolutely?
Yes.
That Mary existed,
yes,
and Mary was a virgin,
yes,
and Jesus was the Son of
God.
God.
Yes.
He's not a Jordan Peterson, that's for sure.
And I...
Are you...
Of course, Glenn has other fish to fry in that video. But Jesus is the Son of God because he is. But what the Son of God does is weave all of these things. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. Give to God what is God. Jesus keeps scrambling this for us. And so this speech is really Jesus, but Jesus has other things to say too. This from Tim Keller's book, Making Sense of God, an invitation to the skeptical. Particularly impressive to readers over centuries has been that what one writer has called, Jonathan Edwards, an admirable conjunction of diverse excellencies in Jesus Christ. That is, in him we see qualities and virtues we would ordinarily consider incompatible in the same person. We would never think they could be combined, but because they are strikingly beautiful. Jesus combines high majesty with great humility. He joins the strongest commitment to justice with astonishing mercy and grace. He reveals a transcendent self-sufficiency and yet entire trust in and reliance upon his heavenly Father. We are surprised to see tenderness without any weakness, boldness without harshness, humility without any uncertainty, indeed accompanied by a towering confidence. Readers can discover for themselves his unbending convictions but complete approachability, his insistence on truth but always bathed in love, his power without insensitivity, integrity without rigidity, passion without prejudice. None of us measure up. We don't have the complete package. And so we live in a body. And so the body needs Paul Kingsnorth. And the body needs, sometimes it needs $1 million worth of marble. Both in the Orthodox Church. I can't get my head around it. And one of my favorite latest quotes. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. The thing about Christian civilization is it seems to almost inevitably arise. People can't help but make civilization. And it's in the backdrop of civilization that you'll get desert fathers, that you'll get monasteries, that you'll get prophets. They're a function of the process. And what you can't do is say, okay, we'll have no talk against Christian civilization. No, we must talk against it. You say, well, how can we fit this all together? Well, we can't. But the city Foursquare, not made by human hands, is the product of God. Now, I should find that moment in the Peterson-Dawkins talk. Okay, who'd have thought I could put these two videos together? Let's go.
Limited universe. Richard asked you before about the difference between a story or an idea naturally evolving over the course of numerous manuscripts and throughout human history, and the idea of it being divinely inspired. And you were
naturally evolving. See, the thing is, the divinely inspired piece gets all the attention, but the naturally evolving, that seems to be in a clean room free of a creator God's handprints. But no, the God of creation is the God of redemption. And so here's the thing. The Father builds the field, and the Son comes and plays a little bit better than the Yankees yesterday.
Seeming to imply that these are almost interchangeable concepts. Now, if that's the case, when you say that this divine spirit behind the Bible is actually just the way that it has evolved throughout the human history, throughout the different manuscripts that we've...
See, and this is part of the problem. And I know, again, because of all these polarities, some are going to jump in and say, are you saying that it's just God is that which evolution produces? Well, that's sort of the God number one idea. But then whenever we think about a God willfully, intentionally, consciously intervening by writing himself into the story, that's God number two. And my argument is always, why do you limit him one to one or the other? Because let's say Steve Jobs creates Apple Corporation. Steve Jobs is all over the corporation, even when Steve Jobs isn't in the room. But when Steve Jobs is in the room, he's there too. It's Steve Jobs as arena and Steve Jobs as agent. And so, on one hand, I am not saying that there isn't something spooky or mysterious or wooey about divine inspiration. Absolutely. But there is also a lot of God number one, arenic God in terms of the development of language and culture, all of which produces, and you have that in the incarnation. And in fact, Peter Enns' best book, I think, was the first one that got him in all sorts of trouble in Westminster, which is that the Word of God, well, you mean the Bible? Yes. Well, how about Jesus? Yes. The Word of God, the virgin birth. Oh, we're going to fight about the virgin birth. The virgin birth is the perfect image of this. Because Mary has hereditary. And the Holy Spirit, through which she conceives, doesn't. And that's a picture of the world. Top and bottom. And why we keep saying, no, you can't have both. No. Because you can. Because the creator God is the redeeming God. And so they got all excited about this idea for a minute.
We've had, then saying that that is what divinity is, I think for you may...
That's not what divinity is, but divinity can do it.
Drag the mundane up into the realm of divinity. But I think for people like Richard and for many people listening, what it doesn't said is...
The Orthodox get that, take the mundane up into the divinity. The Orthodox get that idea.
Drags the divine down to the realm of the mundane.
Very well put, yes.
The divine down to the realm of the mundane. And you're fighting about the virgin birth? Oh, are you saying that that's what happened? Oh, but when you put it in strictly abstract terms, dare we say, sort of mythological, if you put a few other more interesting things on it, then you can sit back and say, oh, I like this idea, Mr. Burns. Gotta screenshot this one. So, yeah, that's a fun one. I shouldn't do my backstage work and when the camera's rolling. Anyway, I am out of time. Watch Paul Kingsnorth's Against Christian Civilization. It is a great, great lecture. It needs to be there. This needs to be a vital part of the body of Christ. But I think the conversation around Christian civilization, whatever that means, also needs to be a part of it, because Jesus just keeps smuggling himself into so many places, and you think you're free of him, and he just keeps coming up. Chesterton, The Everlasting Man, Chapter 6. I have said that Asia and the ancient world had an air of being too old to die. Christendom has the very opposite fate. Christendom has had a series of revolutions, and in each one of them, Christianity has died. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. So, Paul, don't edit. Don't hold back. You know, I want to see you like Nolan Ryan. I got baseball on my head. I want to see you throwing fastballs. I want to see you throwing hard. I want to see you go up into that First Things podium and you let her rip. And you make all the Christian civilizationists squirm and search their soul. Absolutely. Don't hold back. I love it. I love it. I've been around a while. I've got other thoughts too. And I don't want them holding back either. And the beautiful thing is, none of them will. None of them will. And in that way, not by specific human hands that we might bring, but I think by the hands of God that were incarnate, we will see that city. And it's not like any city that any of us can build, which is why we believe in God. So, yeah, this will draw a few comments.